Imagine pulling an old laptop out of a drawer, the kind that wheezes when you press the power button, the kind most people would already have written off as e-waste. And instead of frustration, you feel curiosity. You plug it in, hit the power button, and you're half expecting it to take 5 minutes just to show a login screen. This is where the story of Puppy Linux really begins. Because this tiny operating system was never about chasing the latest hardware or showing off flashy animations. It was about respect for old machines, about squeezing real usefulness out of computers that the modern tech world decided were obsolete. And when you really understand Puppy Linux, you start to see old hardware not as a problem, but as an opportunity. Puppy Linux has always lived a little outside the mainstream Linux conversation. While big distributions compete on enterprise features, cloud integration, or sleek desktop environments, Puppy quietly focuses on one question. How can we make a computer useful again, even if it's old, slow, and forgotten? The answer it gives is surprisingly bold. Instead of assuming you have gigabytes of RAM and fast solid-state storage, Puppy assumes the opposite. It assumes you might have 512 megabytes of RAM, a slow hard drive, or even no hard drive at all. It assumes your CPU might be decades old. And it designs everything around that reality. The first thing that shocks people when they try Puppy Linux is just how small it is. We're talking about an operating system that can be a few hundred megabytes in size, sometimes even less depending on the version. In a world where modern operating systems measure themselves in tens of gigabytes, this feels almost unreal. But that small size isn't just a number for bragging rights. It fundamentally changes how the system behaves. Puppy Linux is designed to load itself into RAM. That means once it's running, it can be incredibly fast, even on slow hardware, because it's not constantly hammering a sluggish hard drive. When Puppy boots, especially from a USB stick or a CD, it copies its core system into memory. On a machine with enough RAM, this means you can even remove the boot media after startup and the system keeps running. This approach is a big part of why Puppy feels so responsive on old hardware. Applications open quickly. The desktop responds instantly. And you don't get that constant grinding sound from the hard drive that you associate with aging machines. For someone used to struggling with old Windows installations, this can feel almost magical. But speed alone isn't enough. An operating system also needs to be practical. Puppy Linux comes with a surprisingly complete set of applications, carefully chosen to balance functionality with performance. You typically get a lightweight web browser, a text editor, a media player, file management tools, and basic system utilities right out of the box. These applications are often lighter alternatives to the big names people know, but they're more than capable for everyday tasks like browsing the web, watching videos, writing documents, or managing files. One of the most important things to understand about Puppy Linux is that it's not just one single distribution. It's more like a family of distributions, often called puplets, each built with slightly different goals or based on different underlying Linux systems. Some versions are built on Ubuntu, others on Slackware, and others are completely independent. This flexibility means you can often choose a Puppy variant that best matches your needs or your hardware. If you want access to Ubuntu's repositories, there's a Puppy for that. If you want something even leaner and more traditional, there's a Puppy for that too. This modular approach also makes Puppy Linux incredibly adaptable. You can run it as a live system from a USB drive, install it alongside another operating system, or even install it entirely to RAM for ultra-fast operation. For old hardware, this flexibility is crucial. Some old machines have failing hard drives, limited storage, or unreliable components. Puppy's ability to run without a traditional installation can literally save a computer that would otherwise be unusable. Another key idea behind Puppy Linux is user control. Puppy doesn't hide the system from you behind layers of abstraction. It gives you straightforward tools to configure hardware, manage network connections, and tweak performance. This can be refreshing for experienced users, but it's also surprisingly friendly for beginners. Puppy uses simple graphical configuration tools for things like Wi-Fi, sound, display settings, and printers. You don't need to be a terminal wizard to get it working, although the terminal is always there if you want it. When it comes to old hardware, driver support is often a concern. Puppy Linux benefits from the Linux kernel's broad hardware compatibility, which is often better than what older versions of Windows can manage. Old graphics cards, legacy Wi-Fi chips, and obscure sound hardware often work out of the box. And because Puppy often uses slightly older, well-tested kernels, it can actually be more compatible with old devices than cutting-edge distributions that drop support for legacy hardware. There's also something deeply satisfying about the philosophy behind Puppy Linux. It challenges the idea that technology must constantly be replaced. In a world drowning in electronic waste, Puppy makes a quiet but powerful statement. Old computers still have value. They can still browse the web, serve as home servers, become learning machines for kids, or act as dedicated tools for writing, coding, or media playback. Puppy Linux turns recycling into something creative and empowering rather than frustrating. For people who want to revive old hardware for specific tasks, Puppy Linux shines. An old laptop can become a lightweight internet machine for email and browsing. An ancient desktop can become a media player connected to a TV. A small, low-power PC can become a simple file server or network tool. Because Puppy is so lightweight, it leaves more system resources available for the actual task you want the computer to perform. One of the things that surprises many new users is how personal Puppy Linux can feel. Settings are often stored in a save file or save folder, which can be kept on a USB drive, hard drive, or other storage. This means you can carry your entire system, including your settings and files, in your pocket, plug your Puppy USB into almost any compatible computer, boot it up, and it's like your own computer comes to life on that machine. For old hardware enthusiasts, this is incredibly powerful. You can test Puppy on different machines without committing to a full installation, and you can move your environment. Of course, Puppy Linux isn't trying to be everything to everyone. Because it prioritizes lightness, you won't find the latest heavy desktop environments or resource-hungry applications included by default. Some modern websites can be demanding, and on very old hardware, even a lightweight browser can struggle with today's bloated web. But Puppy's speed and efficiency still make it one of the best options available when every megabyte of RAM counts. The community around Puppy Linux is another underrated strength. It's not massive, but it's passionate and helpful. Forums are filled with people sharing tips, custom builds, and solutions for unusual hardware problems. Because many Puppy users are working with old or unusual machines, there's a strong culture of experimentation and you'll often find that someone else has already figured out how to get a stubborn old laptop working, and they're happy to share what they learned. There's also a certain joy in learning how a computer really works when you use something like Puppy. Linux, because it's lightweight and transparent, you become more aware of what's actually happening under the hood. You see how much memory applications use, how storage is managed, and how different components interact. For students, hobbyists, or anyone curious about Linux, Puppy can be an excellent learning platform, especially on hardware that would otherwise sit unused. When you compare Puppy Linux to other lightweight Linux distributions, its unique personality stands out. Many lightweight distros aim to be minimal by stripping down larger systems, but Puppy was designed from the start with lightness as a core principle. It's not just a slimmed-down version of something bigger, it's its own thing, with its own way of doing things. That's why it can feel a bit different at first, but also why it can be so effective on old hardware. Another often overlooked advantage of Puppy Linux is how quickly you can get from zero to usable. You don't need a long installation process. You can download an ISO, write it to a USB drive, boot it, and within minutes you're at a desktop. For reviving old machines, this speed matters. It encourages experimentation. If one version doesn't work well in your hardware, you can try another without losing much time. Security is also worth talking about. Puppy Linux typically runs as root by default, which can sound alarming to people used to mainstream Linux distributions. But this design choice is tied to Puppy's goals. It simplifies things and reduces overhead. For old hardware used in controlled environments or offline tasks, this is often acceptable. For internet use, it does mean users should be mindful, but Linux's inherent security model and Puppy's small attack surface still offer a reasonable level of safety, especially compared to unpatched old Windows systems. Over the years, Puppy Linux has quietly kept pace with the evolving Linux ecosystem while staying true to its roots. Modern versions support newer hardware too, but they never forget their original mission. That mission is what makes Puppy so special for old hardware. It's not an afterthought or a legacy mode. Old hardware is the main character in this story. There's a moment that many Puppy Linux users remember clearly. It's the moment when an old computer that was painfully slow suddenly feels alive again. Windows might have taken minutes to boot, struggled to open a browser, and constantly reminded you how outdated the system was. Puppy boots in seconds, opens applications instantly, and doesn't nag you about upgrades or unsupported hardware. That contrast can be genuinely eye-opening. Using Puppy Linux can also change how you think about computing in general. It forces you to question assumptions about what you really need. Do you really need a multi-gigabyte operating system to write text, browse the web, or manage files? Do you really need the latest hardware for everyday tasks? Puppy Linux doesn't just provide answers. It demonstrates them in practice. For people in parts of the world where access to new hardware is limited or expensive, Puppy Linux can be more than just a fun experiment. It can be a practical solution. Schools, community centers, and individuals can extend the life of donated or discarded computers, making technology more accessible. In that sense, Puppy Linux has a quiet social impact that goes beyond the tech enthusiast community. As you spend more time with Puppy Linux, you start to appreciate the careful choices behind it. The lightweight window managers, the efficient file system usage, the focus on speed and responsiveness. Everything is designed to respect limited resources, and that respect is exactly what old hardware needs. In the end, Puppy Linux isn't about nostalgia or clinging to the past. It's about refusing to waste perfectly usable machines just because the software world moved on. It's about empowerment, creativity, and efficiency. It's about showing that with the right tools, even the most modest hardware can still do meaningful work. So when someone asks whether an old computer is still worth using, Puppy Linux offers a confident answer. Yes, absolutely. If you're willing to rethink what an operating system can be, with Puppy Linux, old hardware doesn't have to be slow, frustrating, or useless. It can be fast, functional, and fun again. And that's a powerful reminder that sometimes the smallest solutions make the biggest difference.